In Chapter 8, we've been working with radicals, how to simplify them and do operations with them, and how to work with them in an equation. And now we're going to go back to something that we started way back at the beginning of the chapter, when we had something like the square root of negative 16. We said that is not real. So you might remember we did that. And that's true. It is not real. But we do have a way of dealing with it. We just didn't mention it at the time because it would have been too much to think about. But now we're going to talk about it. And so what it turns out is that we write this expression, it's not real, but we can write it with what's called the imaginary unit. And the imaginary unit is a lowercase I. It's italicized usually. And it looks like that. Okay? So, in this case, we could write the square root of negative 16 as the square root of 16i. And then we could make the square root of 16 4, and so we would write 4i. And that is what we call an imaginary number. Imaginary. Okay, so that's what we're going to work on in this section is imaginary numbers. Okay, so they're not real numbers, but we do have a way to write them and to work with them. Two things that you have to know. The square root of negative 1, by definition, is equal to I. So remember that. And I'll go back and talk about what we just did in a minute. And the other thing you have to remember then is I squared is equal to negative 1. Those two pieces of information, we base all the work that we're going to do with I on those two pieces of information. Okay? So put the box around those, put it in your notes, because those are the two things that we're going to use. All right, so now let's go back to what we did. We had the square root of negative 16, right? So what we're saying is, well, negative 16 is 16 times negative 1. Well, then we're splitting those up into the square root of 16 and the square root of negative 1. But now this we just learned by definition is I. And then this, the square root of 16, we treat that like we've been doing in the past. The square root of 16, that part is real. And it turns out just to be 4. And that's how we got 4i for simplifying that. Okay? So if you have the square root of a negative number, say you have the square root of negative 7, then you're going to think about that as the square root of 7 times the square root of negative 1, and then you're going to make that part the I. Now in this case, the square root of 7 doesn't simplify, and so you would just leave it the square root of 7i. This book tends to write it this way. Some textbooks, I'll just put or, they put the I in front of the radical. Okay? I just want you to be aware of that. So quite a few textbooks write it this way. When I was a kid, we always wrote it this way, and I haven't seen it for years, but in this textbook they do that. Just make sure you don't put the I under the radical sign. It's not under the radical sign. And that's why I think they went to this way in a lot of textbooks, so that would be clear. Okay? And it's a lowercase I. All right, so now we'll practice a little bit with this. Well, yeah. All right, so the square root of negative 81, that's going to be the square root of 81i. But the square root of 81 we know, 9i. So we would leave it like that. And the square root of negative 5, that'd be the square root of 5i. But we don't know the square root of 5. We could get an approximation, but we'd rather have an exact answer. So we're just going to leave it like that. The square root of negative 18. Well, that's the square root of 18i. And then they're going to want you to simplify this part here. Well, that's 9 times 2. And you can take the square root of 9. So it's going to be 3 times the square root of 2i. Okay, Now, when we talked about how other textbooks write it, some books would write it this way, and that's fine. I don't care which way you write it. I'm just going to tell you that in this textbook, you're probably going to see it this way. They made a point of that in the book. Okay. So, what are the set of imaginary numbers? Well, I want to talk a little bit about that. You have the real numbers. The real numbers, those have, you know, your counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They have your whole numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They have the integers, -7, -6, you know, on up, and then all the whole numbers are included in that. It has the rational numbers, so all your fractions and your terminating decimals. And then it has the irrational numbers. Irrational numbers are things like pi, the square root of 7, square root of 5. Those are all irrational. They're decimals that go on and on and on, and they don't repeat, and they don't terminate. So all of your real numbers are those sets of numbers, okay? And they kind of fit inside each other. Every counting number is a whole number. Every whole number is an integer. Every integer is a rational number. And then we divide the line right there, okay? You're either a rational number or you're an irrational number. But together, all these numbers make up the set of real numbers. Then over here, we have the imaginary numbers. Those are going to be things that have an imaginary unit in them, an imaginary part, okay? Anything with an I, basically, okay? Now, all of these, both when you take the real numbers and the imaginary numbers together, that is the set of what we call complex numbers. Okay? So in the set of complex numbers, you're either real or you're imaginary. You're not both. Okay? And that's probably all I want to say on that. So when they talk about the set of complex numbers, they're talking about all the things with I, all the numbers that are imaginary, plus all your real numbers, all the numbers that we have been working with in the past. Okay?